Hello, I'm Alyssa Ford Morell. Welcome to my garden. I'm one of the coordinators at the Glen Carlin Library Community Garden, and we're here today to talk about a particular gardening technique that you might find helpful. It's sometimes called the Chelsea chop, but it is basically a pruning technique used on perennials that bloom in summer or fall. This technique, the Chelsea chop, is one that I wish had been well known when my mother was alive. She would have enjoyed knowing about this. She was a terrific gardener with a beautiful garden. People would often give her gifts of plants, and sometimes in the fall she'd get chrysanthemums. And you know what chrysanthemums look like when you buy them from the store. They're pretty short and tight, and there's massive color bloom all tightly together. Well, Mom would, after they bloomed that year, she'd plant them outside in an area that was specifically for her chrysanthemums. And at Thanksgiving, she'd often send me or a sister out to pick some for the centerpiece. And what we would find was nothing like the original chrysanthemums. Instead, they were these long stalks, 2 to 3 feet, that were not dense and tight together at all. They'd be flopped over from the weather, and they just didn't look anything like that dense cluster of blooms. The bloom itself, each one was the same, but they weren't tightly packed. And that's because a lot of plants naturally like to grow long, but we as gardeners like to see them a little tighter and more dense and not as tall. This is what that technique does. It's called the Chelsea chop because the Chelsea Garden Show is held in England, very famous thing, in late May. And the idea is to make a cut to the perennials that bloom in summer and fall that will benefit from this technique at about that time when the Chelsea Garden Show is happening. In fact, we can do it more often, and that's we can tailor it to whatever we are hoping to do in our own garden. But that's what it has become known as, the Chelsea chop. We're here with my solidago or goldenrod. I also have some aromatic aster behind, all of which will benefit from having the Chelsea chop done on it. I'm going to be doing a couple things here. I'm both going to be kind of cutting at an angle so that as it grows, it has a showy kind of side that presents itself to the eye. And I'm going to be cutting in a range from as much as a halfway down to a third, or you could actually be doing less. Some people like to just cut the very tips off, which encourages more branching here. I'm going to be cutting a bit deeper. You can do this multiple times during the growing season, anywhere from mid-May through about July 4. Nothing's going to happen bad if you do it on July 5, but July 4 is an easy day to remember. I tend to like to cut these guys a couple times. It's what I have time to do and energy to do, and it makes for a really nice show. So the stuff in the front, I'm going to cut fairly low, and I just cut it down. I can either leave the stuff to decompose into the ground or pick it up later on. And I can grab big clumps of it at once if I want. So as I said, the stuff in the front, I'm cutting a good deal shorter. And then as I move a little bit back, I cut a little bit higher up. Of course, I have a slope here, so that also plays into what I'm doing. I'm not taking a lot of time looking at exactly where I'm cutting. I know that this plant really wants to grow, and it's going to cover up the cuts very quickly within a week or two. And I'll just keep going. Okay. Another plant that really can benefit from this technique of pruning is mountain mint. Mountain mint is a wonderful plant that smells fabulous. It is a wonderful pollinator attractor. It does like to spread like most mints, so put it somewhere that you can really exercise some control over it. But this plant has gotten a little bit tall, especially because my husband sits at his computer in this window and he wants to look at the birds that are out this direction. So I want this to be shorter, and I'm going to trim it to a level where he can see out a bit better. So I'm just going to come forward here and be cutting fairly low. And this is a example of where I will cut lower in the front and higher in the back. I'm just really being fairly brutal and cutting a lot off. And it feels a little harsh as I'm doing it, but I'm quite confident that it's going to work out nicely in the long run. And I'm not spending any effort to see exactly where I'm cutting. I'm just trusting to the fact that this is a very hardy plant that will grow back. Oh, there's little daddy longlegs. I don't want to really disturb him. I'll work around him. And bring this all down here, and looks like the daddy longlegs has moved aside. And you can see I'm moving really quickly. This isn't something that you have to belabor and be too nervous about how careful you are on it. It'll all come back nicely. I expect within a week I'm going to start seeing the new growth, and you won't notice any of these chopped off tips after that. Okay. I have one more plant that I'd like to show how to do this technique on. It's not a plant that you will find in lists of plants that really generally benefit from the Chelsea chop. But there's a different reason to do the cutting on this plant. That is the common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca. Common milkweed is one of a number of plants in the milkweed family that are native here in the mid-Atlantic area. It happens to be one of the favorite plants for monarch butterflies to lay their eggs on, because the babies must eat something in the milkweed family in order to grow. So we know that the monarchs are going to be coming through and wanting to have their babies eat this plant. The problem is that this milkweed tends to get quite tough. The leaves become quite leathery by later in the summer, which is actually when the bulk of the monarchs come through on their migration. We get some vagrant types that come through in the spring, but most of them come later. In order to make these leaves more tender and tasty for those babies, and the monarchs need all the help that we can give them, we can do the Chelsea chop on the common milkweed. Common milkweed, by the way, is a plant that likes to spread itself. It is not a plant for the faint of heart because of that fact. It will spread by underground runners, but I grow it specifically for the monarchs and for supporting the insects and animals that depend on native plants. And I have this area of my garden designated for it, and they have grown tremendously. So what we're going to do is cut again as much as halfway down the plant, just like that. And we're going to toss that away. I encourage you to consider doing this on some of your plants. I wouldn't say all of your common milkweed, but some of them. If you do this, they're going to grow new shoots that will be more tender when the monarchs arrive later on in the summer. And we will come back at that time and show you what it looks like when the plants have regrown. But that's basically what you do. I would warn you to watch out for the milk of the milkweed. It is a kind of a latexy, and it's quite sticky. If you get it on your hands, you'll be washing them for quite some time. Here's what the cut looks like just after it's made. And this is what it looks like several months later. You can see multiple stems have grown, making the entire plant fuller, but of course the leaves are also newer and more tender. Here's what the solidago rugosa that I was cutting back earlier in this video looks like in early October when it's just starting to bloom. It's a bit shorter and has a lot more blooms than it would have otherwise. I hope this technique of cutting back perennials as they grow is a useful one to you. Happy gardening.